Walt Whitman. Since I'm a Long Island English teacher, Walt Whitman is pretty special to me because this great American poet was born right here in Huntington, Long Island. And since we're at Walt Whitman's birthplace, this seems like a good spot to talk about the dreaded literary element. Now, literary elements are nothing to be afraid of. They're simply everything an author does to tell his story or make his poem come alive. Plot, characterization, imagery, metaphor, they're all examples of literary elements. Since we're here with Walt today, let's take a look at some literary elements that he used in his poetry. Here's Walt Whitman describing the scene at a Civil War hospital. Surgeons operating, attendants holding lights, the smell of ether, the odor of blood. Well, that is simply imagery. Walt Whitman is using our senses to show us, and in fact make us smell and see how horrible that hospital is. So if you were writing an essay showing that Walt Whitman was angry at the condition of Civil War hospitals, you would use that literary element to prove it. Another example from a poem I'll bet you've all studied in school. Captain, my captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every wrack, the fearful prize is won. Well, there Whitman was writing about the Civil War and America as the ship and Lincoln as the captain who was assassinated just as the war was won. So he was using symbolism to show his grief at Lincoln's assassination. Another example of literary elements is characterization. Here's Whitman not too happy with an astronomy lecture. The proofs, the details, the figures were ranged in columns before me, the charts and the diagrams. Does not sound very interesting, does it? And that was Whitman's point, that the learned astronomer was a very boring man who really couldn't teach him much about the stars. That's the idea of literary elements, the words of the author that show what he meant. Now, let's take a look at how various students use literary elements in their essays. You can see how students referred to point of view, characterization, imagery, in talking about various pieces of literature. Notice that the literary elements are highlighted. So just as they did, that's what you do. Now, Walt Whitman loved poetry and he loved people, and I don't think he would have wanted you to be worried about using literary elements. I think he would want you to think of them as natural storytelling devices. So do that in your essays, and I think Walt will be very happy. I am so excited to be here at Walt Whitman's birthplace that I've decided to write an article about Walt Whitman for the school paper. Now, I've gotten a little bit of information by looking around the house, but I need a lot more. And I'm very fortunate to have next to me Sue Ann Dennehy, the Walt Whitman expert, and she's agreed to give me a lot of good information. So I've got my trusty clipboard and my trusty pen, and I'm ready to take notes. So Sue Ann, tell me about Walt Whitman's wild life as a young man in the city.
Well, Walt Whitman spent a lot of his time from his 20s into his middle life living in Manhattan. He enjoyed the life of Manhattan, the smells, the sights, the sounds. He spent a lot of time in a place called Pfaff's Tavern, which is down in Greenwich Village. Now, if any of your students have seen the movie The Gangs of New York, that is exactly the time period that Walt Whitman would have been in Manhattan. He would have hung out with blue-collar workers, with dock workers, with people who worked in the canneries and on the boats, kind of the low life of the time period. But he also would have hung out with writers and with people who wrote articles in the local papers, and he enjoyed having a pint or two with those people, low life or not.
And that is the big lesson for you on the first part of the Regents, because you are going to listen to a speech, a long speech, and you're never going to see it. And you need to take notes, because that is how you get your essay. For example, on the June 2005 Regents, students had to listen to a very long article about the American reporter Nellie Bly, and then write an essay showing why she was an American hero. The lesson is, when you hear the speech on the Regents, and I hope it's as interesting as this one, don't forget to keep writing down all those notes so that you can write your essay.